Hi there. So today I'd like to talk about how my grandmother was raped by her, what they thought was her psychiatrist, but actually turned out to be a therapist. You may wonder how I could know this happened when it would have happened in the early 1950s, and I wasn't even born until a lot later than then. That's because her therapist was so brazen that he actually wrote a journal article talking about how he believed that this was therapeutic, to allow the patients to sexually act out, which of course was just him, being a rapist. So the story starts with my grandparents had been married for 14 years before my grandmother started to show signs of schizophrenia, or at least blatant signs, I guess. My grandfather would come home from work and she would start to tell him how she was remembering things. She remembered that her mother had murdered her father, that she was actually Gina Gladstone, the lost queen of Scotland. And my grandfather slowly started to realize something was really wrong with her. And he did something that was actually pretty advanced for the day, which was brought her to what he thought was psychiatrist in Garden City, New York. So at first, she actually really enjoyed going to see the psychiatrist. He had this big fancy house, and Garden City is an upscale town on Long Island, New York. And she after a while, she started to tell my grandfather she didn't love him anymore. She started to say she thought that the doctor, whose name was James McCartney, that she thought that he was her father. And she, at one point, I know, threw her ring at my grandfather and said she didn't want to be married anymore, that she was in love with her doctor. And the other part of the story is that my grandfather couldn't actually afford to pay for this psychiatrist. It cost as much to send her to the psychiatrist each week as he was making. So he was falling into terrible debt because he also had 3 children to support on the side of all of this nightmare, and now there was no one at the house to take care of them. So it's kind of notorious in my family that the children ran amok because there was no one taking care of them. My grandfather was in New York City every day working. My aunt tells a story of she remembers my grandmother coming to her and saying, "I'm Gina Gladstone, the lost queen of Scotland." And my aunt said, well, if you're a queen, that means I'm a princess, right? And my grandmother was so excited that someone was buying into her delusion that she got very excited and said, yes, yes, that means you're a princess. And my poor aunt ran around the whole neighborhood telling all the kids that she was a real princess. And when my grandfather got home, she told him too, and he said, "Have you been telling this to other people?" And she said, "Yeah, but they don't believe me." And he had to sit her down and say, "Your mother's having some issues. She's not herself." And it was a very difficult time. So going back and forth to the psychiatrist was the only thing he knew to help her. Obviously, she was getting worse. And he met another doctor, a doctor who it's handed down in my family's name, Dr. Anchel, who believed that maybe it was a hormone imbalance that was causing her mental illness. And he wanted to, and I believe he did, just start giving her hormone treatments. And when McCartney found out about this, he went bonkers and said, "It's either that doctor or me. I won't see her anymore if you're seeing Dr. Anchel too." So my grandfather reluctantly gave up Anchel and just had her see this doctor. Again, my grandfather was under the impression this was a psychiatrist, but later, reading the journal article, he was a therapist. You can read more about it. There's an article called "The Sensuous Psychiatrist." It was originally published in June 19th, 1972 in New York Magazine. There's a reprint on July 28th, 2008. You can find it easily on the web. And in there, you'll see he wasn't the only one who was doing this. And so essentially, my grandfather was bankrupting himself to pay this guy to rape my grandmother, who was mentally ill. When my grandmother had her final breakdown, when my grandfather brought her to the hospital, the local hospital, and to be honest, I don't really know what happened. There's not a clear record of that. I believe she was complaining about pains in her stomach and going bonkers about it, and so my grandfather didn't know what to do and brought her to the hospital. The hospital said there's this fantastic new hospital out east called Pilgrim State. It just opened. It's perfect. They'll be able to take care of her there. So they transferred her there, and that was the beginning of the end. When my grandfather called McCartney to tell him, that she was in the hospital, he said, oh, she was always crazy anyway. And my grandfather was furious. He still owed this guy a fortune. And to have him be so dismissive about my grandmother after all the suffering they've been through, because I'm telling this fast, but this was like 3 or 4 years before she went to the hospital. And my grandfather actually brought it to court. And if any of you guys are good legal researchers, I'm a librarian, but I've never been able to find a record of the court case, but it's got to be out there. It would be Herbert Jones versus James McCartney. The court said my grandfather didn't have to pay him any more money, that the treatment had been bogus, and of course they didn't know anything about the sex at that point. And I believe my grandfather, and in a way I'm very grateful, went his whole life without knowing that happened. I'm not sure he could have taken it emotionally, because what he went through was beyond belief. I don't know what would have happened if she had had a decent doctor, an ethical doctor. But all I know is that he wasn't the only one, and there were a lot of them. So again, the Sensuous Psychiatrist, New York Magazine, you can read all the details about doctors who were doing this. So I guess this is our little Me Too moment, but I think this is anyone would say this is pretty legit. I'll be back with more stories. Thank you.